I'm Nancy Laffey from Completely Quilted, and thank you for watching our presentation on the Amish with a Twist. Here's the booklet. The Amish with a Twist #2 from Nancy Rink. And today I'm going to be showing you what you're going to be making and the techniques you'll need to learn to sew your 3 blocks that you're going to get for month 2. So your month 2 is going to cover block 2, block 3, and block 4. I already have my pieces cut because last video and last month you learned all about how to cut your fabrics into squares and strips. So I'm going to show you the techniques that you'll need to learn to be able to do these half square triangle units and completely as blocks. So these are the 3 fabrics that you'll be getting for the block number 2, which is the flying geese block. And these instructions are the same as when you made the flying geese units in month 1. So a little refresher, you're going to place these fabric squares on the corners, and the great thing about that tool that you used last month, the quick quarter, is because you can use it for anything up to 12.5 inches. So it's long enough for this entire block on this larger one. So you're still going to do your markings and follow those same instructions to make flying geese units. And then how we sew those units together will be different to create a different looking block than we had in our last month. So I've got those marked, and now I'm going to sew right on those 2 lines all of my flying geese blocks. And remember, this is the same technique as sewing a flying geese blocks that you had in month 1. So now you're going to sew these into pairs. And these geese are flying. So when you sew these into pairs, these they're going to be positioned up here. You'll sew them right sides together along this long edge here. And they'll be positioned kind of flying around each other. So that is the way these blocks are positioned in the book. And so then I'm going to take my flying geese and I'm going to just put those right sides together and then sew along that long edge. Stitch those pairs together, and I have pressed them. So I press them going towards the larger segment of that geese so that the seam is underneath that, the big side. That's just the easiest way to stitch it. And I'm kind of trimming my dog ears as I go. So I just cut off any little triangles that I have to straighten up that corner so I have a nice square. And I think that makes it easier when you go to sew these units together. You don't have to contend with anything else. It's just a nice square. And so you just want to look at the position for your blocks. And just like our other 4 patch blocks, we're just going to put right sides together and then stitch those long seams, open that up, and finish our block. Now that I've stitched those pieces together, I have gone ahead and pressed them, and I press them going towards that big section again, and that makes them be pressed in opposite directions, so that when I place that, just like I've been doing, all of my seams will nest. So especially that center seam is the one you want to nest. And then you're going to stitch down and have that finished block. So I have my fabric squares cut for block number 3, which is the bow tie block. So in this block, we're going to be using our Frixion gel pen, the same type of marking pen that we've been using for all of our other blocks. So this time, we are going to be marking our littler squares, and we are just going to mark a line from corner to corner. So you can use any straight edge to mark this. I'm just going to use my Creative Grids ruler because it has a little gripper, so it's kind of nice that that fabric won't shift on me. So I'm going to mark a diagonal line from corner to corner, and this is going to be on the wrong side of my fabric. I'll do this for both of these colors here for the block. Here we go. And when I sew now, I'm going to do a stitch and flip method. So I have the right sides together, and I'm positioning this on the corner indicated in my pattern. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch right on that line. So I've marked my line on my little square from corner to corner, and now I'm going to stitch right on that diagonal line all the way down. Now I can also chain piece at this point. So on my other color, I can just place that down on that corner, position it in front of my presser foot, and stitch that as well. And just continue with all of my flip and turn. So I have finished sewing all of my stitch and flip blocks, and I pressed these also. So you just, after you finish stitching, you just flip it. That's the flip part of the stitch and flip block. Now in the next instructions, she says that it's optional to trim the back side. So the plus side of trimming would be that it will reduce some of the bulk in your quilt. And so when you trim, you do not want to trim the top fabric, the one that's visible, but the two on the back side. And so I just use a little pair of scissors and I just trim that to about 1/4 inch seam. So now when I flip that back, there's just the seam allowance on the back side. So after, or you can decide to not trim that. If that makes you feel uncomfortable, you can leave it in there as well. So now I'm going to position these for how they're going to be sewn. So I'm going to start by sewing the bow tie blocks. And they're a 4-patch, so it's a unit that has 4 squares in it. The 2 squares that you did your stitch and flip method, and you can see that I didn't trim this one here, but this one I did trim. And then I have 2 solid squares. And so when you sew these, you're just going to sew right sides together along that short seam. I'll position this one, right sides together, and I'll stitch my 1/4 inch seam. I've sewn my 1/4 inch seam on those 2 pieces, and when I open them up, I still have that chained together. So here it is when I open them up, and when you press these, you want to press them to the bigger squares. So these seams are going to be going in opposite directions. Pressed, and now I'm ready to place them together. Now remember, one has been trimmed and one hasn't. So you still have that ability to make that choice. And I'm going to nest that seam right there in the center and sew along the long edge here to finish. I have finished all 4 of my bow tie blocks. Now I can position them as shown in your pattern instructions, and these can just be sewn together just like the other 4 patches. The last block that you will sew this month is the Rolling Stone block, which is block number 4. And you're going to sew together and start by sewing a strip set, which we have done in the past. So that won't be a different technique. You'll still place those right sides together and stitch your strip set together and then subcut that. A different technique is going to be making the square in a square. So what you will do is you will take your smaller squares and you're going to mark your diagonal line from corner to corner. And you're going to do that on all of those small squares. So when you sew these, you're going to sew them one at a time, doing your stitch and flip method of stitching on that diagonal line and pressing and flipping. And we're going to keep working around to create that square in a square. I went ahead and stitched on that solid line, and I trimmed the excess from behind for the flip and stitch method. And so now I'm going to just rotate my block, and I'm going to position the next square down on that corner there. So I'm going to continue sewing on that line, pressing and trimming, and then going to continue to rotate around that block. Square in a square block is building. So I've got 2 corners sewn now, and I'm ready to place another corner. And so I will place that and stitch that and follow the same principles of trimming it and then pressing it, and then add my last 3 corners sewn on now, and I'm ready to stitch on my last corner, and that will complete that square in a square block. All 4 of my square in a square blocks are sewn, and my strip set has been cut into the cross-cut segments. I'm ready to lay out my block. So this block is it's a 9 patch versus the 4 patches that we've been doing. So we're going to start by placing our square in a square right sides together, and then I just build my quilt like this. So I know I'm going to sew this seam here, and then I'm going to position right sides together the next square that's going to be sewn, and then the next one. So then I'm going to take these to my sewing machine and sew 1/4 inch seam down all 3 sides. So now I've stitched these together, and I just left the chain together as well, and that just helps me when I press it to keep everything straight. And so when I pressed this, I pressed in the opposite direction. So I pressed going towards my strip set here, I pressed going towards my strip set here, and then again towards my strip set here. So now along the same lines, I'm going to position right sides together this other side. So these 3 will get positioned, and I will stitch those 1/4 inch seams all the way down and then press those. Now that I have the 3 blocks sewn and pressed in my 3 rows, now I'm ready to put this together, and I'll start with this top row, placing that right sides together, and these seams here and here will nest because I pressed those going in opposite directions. Thanks for watching our video tutorial on how to sew your blocks for your month 2. So these are going to be block number 2, the flying geese block, block number 3, the bow tie block, and then your block number 4, which is the rolling stone block. I hope you enjoyed sewing with me today, and tune in next month for our month number 3 presentation.